Here we're going to talk about how we can model employment as a principal-agent relationship. So here's what we have to do. We have to think back to what our definition was of a principal-agent relationship and what the necessary conditions were to have such a relationship. So we know two conditions are important. Firstly, we have a conflict of interest between the parties. So the actions or attributes of the agent affect the payoffs of the principal in such a way that there is a conflict of interest between the principal and the agent. That's the first condition that we require. The second condition that we require is that there be incompleteness of contracts. What this means is that the agent's actions or attributes are not subject to an enforceable contract, either because they are not known to the principal, or even if they're known, they are not verifiable for some other reason. So when they're not verifiable, remember that means that they can't be taken costlessly to a third-party enforcement mechanism. Okay. Now, the picture here, the painting behind me, that's a detail from a set of murals by Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera was a Mexican and American muralist in the early 20th century. So these were done close to the time of the Great Depression. And they were done in the River Rouge plant near Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. And you can see them in the center there in Michigan, even today. They've been moved from where the factory was for the Ford factory, but you can actually see them. You might also know Diego Rivera's partner, Frida Kahlo, who was a very important artist. Okay. So anyway, we're not going to talk about more art here, but let's think for a moment about the exchange between Ford and his workers. So does this exchange between Ford and workers fit this categorization of a principal-agent relationship? So firstly, the conflict of interest. Ford profits if his employees, if his workers, work hard or fast. Okay, so preferably they're exerting effort and they're working quickly and well. Now the problem is that for workers, the workers prefer to work at a slower pace, both for their own safety. So if you're working more slowly, you're typically going to be safer at the end of the day. And also because it's hard work to work for long hours and to exert effort at a high pace. They don't want to go home fatigued every single day. So there's going to be a conflict of interest there as to what the principal, Ford, wanted from the workers and what the workers want. In terms of an incomplete contract, here's an additional important fact. The workers' effort, manifested in many, many different tasks that they perform per day, was often done as a part of teams of workers. If you're in a team of workers, identifying the effort of one individual team member is incredibly hard. It's hard to measure, it's hard to quantify. Okay, so what that means is it's very difficult to contract for that kind of work. So that meant that it's hard for Ford to specify in a contract what each worker should be doing. Okay? So yes, he wanted them to work hard, and yes, he wanted them to work well, but trying to do that in a way where you're trying to measure the input of every single worker when workers are working on a team is hard. Now, what this means is that employment contracts are almost always necessarily incomplete in modern economies. So what we want to think about here is three reasons that we had for that in the earlier chapter and how they're going to apply in the employment context. So firstly, asymmetrical non-verifiable information. Thinking about this, we've got this idea of cyberloafing, so texting with friends or surfing the web while you're at work. Now, think about that the extent of that may be unknown to the employer, and even if it is, the evidence of it may be hard to take to a third-party enforcer or to enforce in a contract. Right, so that's one aspect. So like web loafing or cyber loafing, scrolling on your phone, that kind of thing when you're meant to be working. That kind of asymmetrical, non-verifiable information, it's hard to put into a contract. Time is another important aspect. Here is that work contracts may last a day, a month, or many, many years. So what that means is that the employer has no way to determine the tasks he would like the employee to do under all the possible conditions that might arise over the period. So think about this, right? And just notice I said like the employer has struggles to work out all the tasks he would like the employee to do. Okay, so quick correction there. But when you're thinking about this, right, it's hard for the employer to specify what the worker should be doing at every single circumstance, especially when the contract is lasting a long time, and especially when there's uncertainty about the state of the world in which someone is working. Additionally, and related to this, is the problem of measurement. So for many tasks, there are no measures of work done. So it's hard to specify the quantity and quality of task completion. So it's hard to do this in a way that is precise enough to have a specific complete contract. Now, we will talk about contexts in which this can be done. So for example, we spoke about the gig economy in chapter 10, and we'll return to that idea here. Those kinds of tasks, which are what we call piece rate tasks, where the job can be specified sufficiently narrowly that you can measure whether it's done competently or not, that means the contract is going to be more likely to be complete, and we're not likely to have a principal-agent relationship. But in other contexts where it's hard to measure the quality of the work done, then in those contexts, we're much more likely to have an incomplete contract. Okay, so here we've got a table where we're going to be contrasting the different outcomes and the different models that we've looked at. We had the Benetton model in chapter 10, and we're looking at the Ford model in chapter 11. Another name that we're going to be using in chapter 11 is the labor discipline model. We're going to be using this term labor discipline because, like in chapter 10, the employer is going to potentially fire or terminate the worker, and as a consequence, the worker would be denied the employment rent. That's why we've got this idea of disciplining labor in an employment relationship. I'm going to make myself disappear temporarily. Okay, so in the Benetton model in chapter 10, we had a buyer in the role of principal, for example, Benetton, whereas in the Ford model, we have the employer, such as the Ford Motor Company. In chapter 10, we had the producer and seller of a good. In chapter 11, we have the worker who is employed. In chapter 10, we had something which was non-contractual for the agent, or the non-contractual action. That was the quality of the good provided by the seller or the producer of the good, the subcontractor, and that was the quality Q. In chapter 11, we're going to be talking about the effort and care by the worker in their employment. The effort and care by the worker, we're going to call that E. In chapter 10, we had the termination of a subcontract, T as a function of Q. So you terminated the subcontractor if they provided too low quality within the lifetime of the contract. Whereas in chapter 11, we're going to be talking termination of employment as a consequence of effort, T as a function of E. So they're going to be very similar, notice. What's the agent's fallback option after they're terminated? They could potentially match with another buyer after searching. In the Ford model, we've got unemployment insurance, or the unemployment benefit, then another job after your job search. Then finally, what does the principal do? The principal sets a price and a termination schedule, so there's a P and T Q. What happens in the employment relationship? The employer sets the wage and a termination probability, W and TE. We then finally want to ask ourselves, who is on the short side of the market? We saw in the previous chapter that this was the side of demand, the excess supply of goods. So what happened there? The people who were on the side of demand, the principals, they were on the short side of the market. They were demanding contracts from potential subcontractors, and as a consequence, there was excess supply of goods by potential subcontractors who would have liked to get contracts. In the labor context, what do we have? We've got demand with an excess supply of labor by workers. So there's involuntary unemployment as a result. So in both of those contexts, what did we see? We see that the principal is on the short side of the market and the agent is on the long side of the market. Okay, so how complete can an employment contract be? That might be a question we want to ask ourselves. And here, when we're thinking about this, that even with substantial growth in the gig economy, like we explored previously, where those contracts are piece rate contracts, piece rate being paying a rate, such as an amount of money, for a piece, a thing that gets done, the number of piece rate workers in the United States and in many other economies is actually still pretty small. It's not more than 5%. Now, in certain contexts, that might have increased somewhat because of the coronavirus, but in many other cases, it also decreased because people weren't able to do certain tasks they had available to themselves previously. Okay, now, what we have to think about here is that there are many sectors in the modern economy where the work that is done is really hard to measure. So think about this. Think about care work. So care work, nurses and care workers in elderly care homes. Personal security, such as the security of your home and the insurance of your goods. We can think about knowledge production, so working in the production of new technologies and new ideas, new software. It's hard to measure exactly what people are doing there when they're participating in a team. And also the distribution of knowledge to people in this new economy. Again, hard to measure. Now, these kinds of tasks have grown significantly. Now, we do see that people are still producing these goods, right? So that means they must be having contracts which allow people to exert effort and do so in a way where stuff gets produced. But the question is, are these underlying contracts complete? And we will say, in general, no, they're not. So, piece rate compensation is the kind of work that I was speaking about previously, where people are paid for a specific kind of task done. And for example, what we see there is there's an example where an auto glass installer in the company, an auto glass company in the United States, shifted from hourly wages for their workers to paying piece rates. Now, what happened there is that output by the workers increased by about 20%. So what does that mean? By making the contract closer to complete, in that context, workers started exerting more effort. Now, in another context, when British Columbia tree planters randomly assigned piece rates to some of the planters and not to others, they were paid by the number of trees planted in this context. They outperformed by 20% those who were just going by a fixed wage. So this is just showing us the importance of piece rate contracts and how making that contract more complete is often resulting in greater effort by the agents. All right, in the next section, we're going to be talking about the Ford model as a model of labor discipline, and we're going to contemplate the complete contracting case. Because we're just ending on this point about piece rates, that piece rate idea maybe leads us into this question of what's going to happen in complete contracting.